We've all heard the promise of a quick war, right? A short-term excursion that'll be over in no time. But what happens when that promise just falls apart? Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating speculative article from the newspaper Dawn. It paints a picture of exactly that scenario, imagining a near-future conflict between the US and Iran. So the whole thing kicks off with a promise that sounds, well, pretty familiar, doesn't it? The article says then President Trump pitched the whole operation as a short-term excursion. Get in, get it done, real quick and decisive. That was the game plan. But the reality the author describes, yeah, that was a whole different story. And get this, according to the article, it took just 2 weeks for that whole quick victory idea to completely vanish. Instead, the conflict just sank into this brutal, devastating war of attrition. A real meat grinder with no end in sight. So the big question the author asks is, how on earth did it all go so wrong, so incredibly fast? Okay, so our first section looks at Iran's unexpected defiance. And according to the author, this is where the first huge miscalculation happened. The thinking was that Iran would just crumble. But that's not what happened. Not at all. Instead, the U.S. was met with this incredible, fierce defiance, all rallied around a brand new and totally unexpected leader. And here's the absolute heart of that miscalculation, according to the author. The U.S. goal? Simple, regime change. But the airstrikes that were supposed to take out the leadership, they did the exact opposite. They created this power vacuum, and it was filled by someone new, someone even more defiant, who basically became this powerful symbol for the whole country's resistance. So who is this new leader? Well, at the center of it all is a man basically forged by tragedy, Mujtaba Khamenei. The article paints this picture where he's the son of the assassinated leader, and wow, he lost his father, his mother, his wife, sister, and his son in those first attacks. I mean, his entire family. The author argues that this insane personal loss, plus his father becoming a martyr, just rallied incredible public support. For a guy like that, surrender isn't just a political option on the table, it's completely, totally unimaginable. Okay, so Iran's defiance was one thing. But of course, a conflict like this never stays contained, does it? The author shows how it immediately starts spilling over the borders, and that creates the first huge ripple effect. The whole region gets thrown into chaos, especially America's key allies in the Gulf. And you can see here just how high a price those allies paid. The article makes a really key point. Because they were hosting U.S. military bases, they suddenly had a giant target painted on their backs. Iranian missile strikes apparently started hammering their oil and gas facilities, crippling their economies. And even worse, they went after the desalination plants, which, you have to remember, is where they get most of their fresh water. We're talking about an existential threat here. So you have chaos in the region, and that sets off a second, even bigger shockwave that's felt literally all over the world. The author then traces how this one conflict sparks a global economic crisis, which, as you can imagine, leads to some really intense political drama. And the economic hit was like immediate and brutal. Think about it. Gulf energy gets disrupted, so what happens? Oil and gas prices everywhere just go through the roof. And that raised the very real possibility of a global recession, the kind of thing that hits everybody's wallet, no matter where you live. But while the rest of the world is panicking about the economy, the author points to this really starkly different message coming from the top. There's a Truth Social post mentioned, said to be from President Trump, that calls the whole crisis, quote, a very small price to pay for USA and world safety and peace. I mean, can you imagine? According to the article, that statement just left even America's closest allies completely stunned. So you've got this escalating crisis. How do you justify it? Well, the article looks at that too. It points to people like Senator Lindsey Graham, who apparently started talking about the war in these big religious terms, calling it a civilizational clash. And the author's argument is that this kind of rhetoric is a really powerful way to give a sort of faith-based justification for a war that they say was both illegal and deeply unpopular. All this global turmoil, as you might guess, creates these impossible situations for countries caught on the sidelines. And to really bring this point home, the author uses Pakistan as a perfect case study to show how a nation can get caught right in the crossfire. Okay, so to really get Pakistan's dilemma, we first have to talk about this thing called the Board of Peace, or BOP. The article describes it as this Trump-led initiative that a lot of people saw as a way to go around the UN. And its credibility? Well, according to the author, that was just blown to bits when the war started, just days after a big BOP summit. Kind of makes you think its purpose wasn't really peace, right? And the author lays out this clear timeline of how Pakistan walked into this really dangerous spot. It all started with trying to get back on good terms with the US. They even nominated Trump for a Nobel Prize. Then, they jumped on board as one of the first members of that Board of Peace. And the result? Now, the article argues, Pakistan is basically trapped, with a very real risk of getting dragged into the whole mess. And just to show this isn't just one person's opinion, the author pulls out a New York Times headline that, honestly, says it all. Pakistan praised Trump, now it risks being caught up in his war. That's a pretty stark warning, isn't it? It really highlights the potential price you pay for some of these big geopolitical choices. So, when you put it all together, Iran's defiance, the chaos in the region, the global economic disaster, it all brings us back to the author's main point. And it's a powerful one. A war that starts with a big miscalculation doesn't just end there. It creates this cascade, this waterfall of unintended and often devastating consequences. So let's wrap up with the key takeaways from the author's analysis. What are the big lessons here? Well, first, never, ever underestimate your opponent's will to fight back. That's a huge mistake. Second, that promise of a short war, yeah, it can blow up into a global crisis before you know it. Third, you've got to be careful because sometimes these peaceful initiatives are really just cover for a military agenda. And maybe the biggest one, when a major conflict picks off, there aren't really any sidelines. Other countries, even allies, get forced to make some really, really tough choices. And in the end, the article doesn't really give us any easy answers. It's not supposed to. Instead, it just leaves us with this one really provocative question. And it's a question that goes way beyond this one fictional story, right? It's a question for any country that finds itself caught between bigger powers. Are you willing to knowingly get pulled into a fight that somebody else started?